Hello everyone, and welcome to Ending the Cold War Between Techcomm and Marcom. My name is Sara O'Keefe, and I'll be doing the presentation today. As we get started, I did want to actually start this off with a poll before I get myself in too much trouble. I wanted to ask the question of what kind of information you produce. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look and dropping in, the kind of content that you produce, I believe you can vote for more than one option. And let's just sort of take a look and see who we have on the line here before I decide which type of group I'm going to be meaner to here today. So we always get complaints about not providing an other button, so I gave you the option for Techcomm, Marcom, and Othercom. All right, well, this is looking like a fairly straightforward kind of thing. I'll go ahead and close this poll, and we can take a look at the results. So 93% of you are doing Techcomm and 7% Marcom, which is perhaps, given what Scriptorium does, not all that surprising that we would have those kinds of results from our typical audience. So welcome aboard. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If any of you are in Asia Pacific, I'm really, really sorry, and thank you for staying up for this. So I want to talk today about Techcomm and Marcom and the issues between them and what kinds of things we might be able to do with them. As we get started here, if you wouldn't mind locating the questions area in GoToWebinar. In some cases it's a tab, in some places it's a drop-down. It depends on what interface you're using. That is what we will use to take your questions as we're going along. And in the questions area, go ahead and type in whatever questions you may have, and I will try and keep an eye on those as we're going along and answer them either as we are working through this or at the end if we still have time. So, as I said, my name is Sara O'Keefe. I am the founder and president of Scriptorium Publishing. We've been in business here since about 1997, before it occurred to anybody to really talk about content strategy. We're based in North Carolina, where the sun is finally shining today. I co-authored with my coworker here, Alan Pringle, a book called Content Strategy 101, which addresses some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And later on, I will provide you with a link to where you can get the book for free. My particular interest over my career has been this question of how content, publishing, and technology all kind of intersect, collide, interface, conflict, all those wonderful words. So those are the kinds of things we're interested in. In particular, we do a lot of content strategy work these days, and within that, a lot of XML work. But we're not exclusively tied to any particular thing. So for starters, we have a lot of stereotypes about marketing, Marcom, and about Techcomm. And I don't think I have to really ask you to provide some of those stereotypes, but you know what they are. And I want to get away maybe a little bit from talking about stereotypes about technical writers and marketing writers and talk a little bit more about the stereotypes that we have around the content that is produced in those two groups. And in order to do that, I would like to talk for a minute about pigs. Marcom, the stereotype says, produces shiny objects that are beautiful, that people want. There's not really any real content there. And this is, if you ask Marcom to describe a pig, this is what you would get. And don't, notice, of course, that they have put lipstick on the pig. So this is the Marcom view of a pig. On the Techcomm side, we have a somewhat different view. First of all, Techcomm is going to tell you that, well, a pig is one of a class of animals, and they all have these kinds of butchering options. It's kind of dull, it's maybe boring, but it's maybe useful. But the problem we run into is that neither one of these views really tells a complete story about what is a pig. So we really have to think about, when we're trying to describe a product, when we're trying to describe a particular kind of software or hardware or medical device or whatever kinds of things that you're documenting, how do you tell the complete story about that product? And so the reality is, of course, that Techcomm and Marcom are complementary. They help each other, and if you read both things, you'll get a much better idea of what the product is all about. And that then begs this really interesting question of, well, if that's the case, if you really need both to do a good job of describing a product, then why is it that we're so terrible at collaboration? Why do we do such a horrible job of having these two organizations work together in general? So we asked this question of, why is there so much friction between Techcomm and Marcom? Why don't they like each other? Why don't they work together? And I think that we have to start with the problem that they have two different goals. The goal of Marcom basically is to tell a story about a product so that people will buy it. You tell a story about how if you own this particular car, then you will have this wonderful nightlife and you will have a good time and you will party with all your friends. Techcomm's goal is to explain how to use the product. So Techcomm goes into details about braking distance. But it doesn't tell you that braking distance is a wonderful thing because you'll be able to brake in time, you know, before the little ducklings cross in front of you like you saw in the ad. So Marcom tells a story and tries to maybe appeal to you some sort of emotion to get you to buy. And Techcomm explains, you know, the features. It's made of metal and it does this. And the problem is that sometimes the story and the explanation don't quite mesh together, and you get this sort of push-pull problem. Here's how we look at Marcom and Techcomm in general. Marcom has very few details. It's very high level. Techcomm has lots of details, maybe too many details. Marcom has huge impact on revenue. People decide to buy because they read a marketing piece. Techcomm, that's afterwards. They've already bought it. It has no effect whatsoever on revenue. Marcom's purpose is to persuade. Techcomm's purpose is to inform. Marcom, on the analytical side, they usually do look at analytics, you know, things like web analytics, who is reading these pages, that type of thing. Rarely do we have analytics in Techcomm, although it is increasing. Product positioning. If you're trying to position your product as a luxury product or as a budget product or as a whatever, Marcom does that. Techcomm does it in many cases, but usually not on purpose. It's not a planned kind of thing. And Marcom is consumed or read before the buying decision. Techcomm is consumed or read after the buying decision. That's sort of the general thing that we look at. So there's an enormous amount of division. They don't have anything in common. There's no overlap, right? They're just completely separate kinds of things. So it becomes no wonder that the two sides aren't really getting along. I mean, after all, we can't even agree whether Marcom, whether the word communication has two M's or one M in its abbreviation. But now we need to go back and look at this some more and think a little bit more about the reality of what this looks like, because this chart I've set up is the one extreme, but I don't think it reflects reality today. Today what we have is something a little more like this. Marcom is becoming more and more and more detailed. There's more and more information being put out before the buying decision. Techcomm, because it is available out there in the world and it is perhaps searchable, or there are social media and people are talking about it, you get these discussions of, oh yeah, they make a decent product, but you know, the documentation is just terrible. So that has an impact on revenue, that if the Techcomm is bad, people will talk about it. If the Techcomm is good and it contributes to the user experience, people will talk about that. The purpose of both kinds of documents becomes to persuade and to inform. You can't just write a fluffy persuasive piece and get people to buy a product. They want the technical details also. You can't just write Techcomm that is dry and referencey and doesn't have any persuasive component, because sometimes people read this stuff before they buy, so you need to worry about that. More and more use of analytics in Techcomm. More and more recognition that Techcomm does affect the product positioning. And Techcomm is being read not just after the buying decision, but also before the buying decision. So we start to see these kind of meld together into something that really does have a little more in common than it did before. So we end up with some sort of Techmarcom that has an overall general similarities across these various categories that I've put in here. So then we look at this and we say, well, this is great, and we can work with this, and we can make this happen. But then reality sets in because we have a pretty significant organizational problem. And the organizational problem is that we are going to run into a division, we're going to run into a division between the Techcomm people and the Marcom people because the organizational structure is not really set up to support collaboration. In fact, in many cases, it's set up to prevent collaboration, and that's what we run into today. Now, given that something like 93% of you are doing Techcomm, I do have another poll which I wanted to throw up, and I wanted to ask the question of who your C-level executive is. So do you report to the CTO, the CIO, some other O, maybe the CIO, or the Chief Marketing Officer, the CMO? And if you don't have a C-level, but you will report to, for example, the VP of Marketing, that would put you over in the CMO category. And for those of you that are putting in other, if you wouldn't mind dropping into the questions area who that other is, that would be helpful. But do you fall under marketing technology, CIO, which would be IT, or is it something, or CEO, which I didn't give you the spelled out version for, or is it something else? And I'm curious to see what those something else might be. All right, oh, this is interesting. So apparently I did not do a very good job of constructing this poll because the answer, I will go ahead and click on this and share the results. The answer is that the plurality of you report to other. CTO followed by CTO, CMO/CEO, and then CIO. So actually not what I expected. So let me take a quick look here at the questions and see what kinds of answers we're getting on this. Project manager, operations, customer experience design, webmaster, engineering manager under division, other because I'm in independent contractor, and product management. Okay, so a whole bunch of other kinds of places that people can report to. Okay, great, thank you. So I will close the poll, and I will go back to my main screen here. So the difficulty we run into is that in any given organization, typically Marcom and Techcomm do not report to the same C-level executive. Marcom almost always reports to the Chief Marketing Officer or whatever category that may be, and Techcomm usually, in my experience, usually reports to the CTO or maybe the CIO, usually not the Chief Marketing Officer. And my poll numbers kind of bear that out. I had a lot of others, but they had to do with engineering, which I would put under the CTO, or product management, which I'd probably put under the CTO, even if you're not quite set up that way. But certainly you're not part of marketing, although product management, I suppose, might be. Anyway, so we run into this problem that Marcom and Techcomm are on opposite ends of the enterprise. They don't report to the same C person, and as a result, what's going to happen is that in order for you to have formal collaboration between Marcom and Techcomm, the C people have to get together, which is, let's say, problematic. So we just have this big collaboration problem here. And one possibility that we might look at is, well, should we have something called a CCO, a Chief Content Officer? And this is something that Alan Porter's been talking about a lot. But what I want to know is, if we already have a CIO, a Chief Information Officer, then, well, why do we need also a Chief Content Officer? But really, CIO is the Chief Information Technology or IT Officer. It's a systems job. It's not a content job, usually. So this is a problem. Chief Content Officer has been kind of bandied about as a possibility. We see a lot of discussion around it at various conferences, and people are talking about it. There's actually a magazine for the CCO. And maybe this is maybe this is the direction it's going, but I see a lot of CCO discussions that is around web marketing and not so much around Techcomm. So I'm a bit skeptical, but it would be lovely from a C-level executive point of view to have a single executive that manages both groups. That said, in my experience, when both groups report up, for example, through marketing, that's not always nirvana either. So most of us are not in a position to actually establish a Chief Content Officer CCO position or to hire a CCO, so maybe we should start with something a little bit smaller. And that is this question of how do we break down these barriers that hinder collaboration between Marcom and Techcomm if we don't have an executive driving the effort? What can we do at an individual level to start making this happen, assuming that you agree that this is something that would be helpful? And the short version of the answer is that you need some mutual respect and some good relationships. Slinging around words, you know, stereotypes of tech writers or stereotypes of marketing writers does not contribute usefully to the discussion. So all those discussions about, oh, those marketing people don't know what they're doing, or oh, those Techcomm people won't talk to me because they're so shy, these are not useful discussions. If the organization chart does not support it, then what we need is informal ways to build relationships across these groups. Is there content overlap? How much is there? Can it be coordinated? Can you coordinate messaging, formatting, timing? Can you have a closer collaboration? And can you start small with something that, you know, won't get you fired if it fails? The place that I like to look for this is data sheets. They're usually considered marketing content, but in many cases they include reference data and other specifications and very detailed kind of Techcomm-ish things. So if we take a look at a few examples of these, if you look at this data sheet, the top section that I circled as features, that's Marcom. You know, it's talking about features and benefits. It's less technical than some of the other stuff. It's still pretty technical in this example. But the rest of what's on this page is mostly Techcomm. It is technical documentation about this particular product and the specs. This one, from what I can tell, is all Marcom. This is all about exceptional levels of this and surpassing today's that and the market leader in blah and comprehensive this, complete, stylish, and fully featured. You know, those are marketing words. So this is an example of a data sheet that's pretty much all Marcom. And then we have a different one here where the first page is all Marcom. It's all about, you know, the good things that it will do for you and isn't this lovely. And you'll see there are adjectives and adverbs, you know, advanced capabilities, easily respond, those kinds of things. But this same data sheet, around about page 3, it's all Techcomm. So it looks to me as though this is a case where, you know, the marketing people and the Techcomm people kind of need to put their heads together and work together on these documents. Or maybe you need people working on data sheets that have a foot in both camps to work through this. So this then brings us to this really interesting question in terms of data sheets of, well, what should the data sheet look like? I mean, what should it actually look like? What is a data sheet? Because they're not really sheets. They're not really pieces of paper, or they don't really have to be. And then you ask this really interesting question of why are we giving people those pages and pages of specifications like I had on the previous page? Why can't we give them a more efficient way to understand this content instead of giving them this huge table they have to work through? So we started thinking about online configuration tools. Let me come back to this in a second. And, you know, from the Techcomm world, you might see something like this as an online configuration tool. This is not what I had in mind, but maybe it's something more like this. You specify the various features that you care about, and then I will tell you magically which of my products meet those specifications. You can then presumably click on one of those products and get more information about it and, you know, then review that specific product. But you don't have to do the work of plowing through pages and pages of data to narrow this down. So this is an example of parametric search or faceted search that allows you to narrow down your options to get to something that's reasonable so that you can then drill down into your information and spend some time on that. The metadata that's needed to drive this, and I know this week metadata is a bad word, but the metadata that's needed to drive this is fairly straightforward. But the data sheet that needs to be built under it is pretty challenging. So in data sheet development, what we found is that it is really, really common because of the interaction that's needed between the two organizations, between Marcom and Techcomm. It is really, really common to have massive copying and pasting going on from one department to the other, rewriting going on from one department to the other, and big, big problems with managing updates because there's just no good way to do it when you don't have an integrated workflow of some sort. So we'll ask questions around who's the owner of the content, who contributes the content, where does it come from in engineering, what does this workflow look like, can we clean it up, can we make it better, can we automate the parts of it that are not particularly value added from a writing point of view. So if you look at my data sheet again here, this table should be generated automatically. There's very little in here that is written in the sense of writing sentences, writing useful, compelling sentences. The first page with all the Marcom on it, I can totally see that. So our first shot at this might look something like this, but this is not a very pleasant user experience, and we're going to move on to something more like this one, which would be a lot more fun. I do think that we're going to see some convergence where we don't have Marcom on one side and Techcomm on the other side. What we're going to have, I think, is Marcom with more technical messages, or perhaps Techcomm with more marketing messages. We get some mutual benefits out of this. From the Techcomm side, for whatever reason, Marcom tends to have an easier time getting the attention of executive management and getting resources. So I think Techcomm's major benefit here is understanding much better how to position themselves in an organization to be relevant. Marcom can use the content that's coming from Techcomm to clarify features and benefits, to prove claims of leading-edge capabilities, and also to look at some of these automation single sourcing questions. This is something that Techcomm is very, very good at, and when applied to Marcom in the right places, could be potentially helpful. Techcomm can provide search engine optimization benefits. Techcomm content can help drive traffic to a given website, and it can help to improve a company's reputation based on them providing useful, relevant content. Now, that is a bit of a double-edged sword because, of course, if the content is really bad, they can also reduce their reputation, or it can affect their reputation negatively if the content is really terrible. I do think, though, that it is time for Marcom and Techcomm to maybe do a little bit less of this. We don't necessarily have to be on the same team, but maybe we could move on to some sort of mutual respect and actually understand what the two groups do and what their mutual relationships are and how they need to interact more closely. The Cold War was not a good thing for pretty obvious reasons, and I think we need to kind of put all of that stuff in the past, move on to a happy place where we have gotten out of the Cold War, we're sitting on the Berlin Wall and partying, and maybe most critically, this convergence that's starting to happen here, we really need to be careful with this. Because for a long time, Techcomm and Marcom kind of looked askance at each other. Now we're getting a little more, a little more respect, a little more interest across the groups. But now what I'm starting to hear is, oh, those tech support people writing their unauthorized content, or oh, those terrible users writing all this content that hasn't been vetted and hasn't been reviewed, approved, and is not up to our standards. Well, that may be true, but there's a reason why they're doing it, and we have to think about that and not just dismiss them out of hand. So with that, I believe I will take some questions. I will take a look at the questions tab, and let's see what you have in there. I'll also put up some contact information in a bit when I get a chance. And let's see what you have here. All right, so do take a look at the questions tab. I have a few things coming along in there. But there's a question here about the use of content strategy. Excuse me, the use of the content strategy term for web content. There's crossover of some typical tasks, but the web job version covers other tasks not necessarily relevant to a Techcomm content strategist. The web content strategist is more marketing connected. And do I have any thoughts on this? Yeah, so this is a really interesting kind of phenomenon because content strategy by definition is supposed to be a big picture strategic kind of thing. And almost immediately we've introduced this concept of web content strategy, which almost always is specific to just marketing and sometimes even just a subset within marketing of the content. So my argument would be that content strategy needs to be applied to high-value content within your organization. That is not at all the same thing as all content or enterprise content or anything like that. High-value content within your organization is information that is needed by your customers or needed by someone that is important. So typical categories of this are Techcomm content, training content, Marcom content. Anytime you have professional people creating content, it's probably high value, or it's supposed to be. At a minimum, it's expensive to develop. In addition to those, you might look at some less obvious things. Tech support content, knowledge bases, records of tech support calls, those kinds of things. Also, proposals. There may be some stuff over in sales land, proposals, statements of work, product description, those kinds of things. But those are the pieces that I look for in a big picture strategy. Now, the question of web content strategy versus all other, I do think they're going to converge. And so we need to start thinking about how to deal with that. You know, how are we going to deal with this convergence issue? Because we do have a requirement, I think, to think about these from an enterprise point of view. All right, other questions here. This is an interesting one. So to excel in Marcom, does a background or experience in sales or business development help? I assume that it may not matter much in Techcomm. Well, I'm not sure I agree with the second part of that a background in sales or business development does not matter in Techcomm, unless we assume that Techcomm is not relevant to the sales cycle, which historically it hasn't been, but I think part of my argument is that that's starting to change. So, to excel in Marcom, does the background or experience in sales or business development help? In general, yes. I mean, in general, I think the more experience you have in, anything, all experience is helpful. Sales versus marketing, sales usually is about going to a specific customer and selling a specific thing, where marketing is more about making your possible customers around the world aware of the thing that you're trying to sell. It's not the greatest distinction, but that would be one way of looking at it. So yes, I do think those are different aspects of more or less the same thing. So, okay, so here we have a question from somebody very anonymous. Marketing and I report to the same boss who knows nothing about either, and I'm going to assume either is marketing and Techcomm. The marketing team is trying to take over my responsibilities, and they go about it in the typical slap-up marketing way. That's a good example to anonymous person of how not to stereotype marketing. I'm at a loss for how to show my boss the value I add in the details that I am providing. Okay, so first of all, are you actually, what is the value that you are adding? Is it actually in the details that you are providing? Is that where you're adding the most value? If so, show what happens when those details are left out. I mean, don't actually leave them out, but show them an example. Hey, if you leave this out, this will happen, and these bad things will happen, and then this will blow up over here. So give them a business example. I would not assume that you can go to a clueless boss and say, look, their punctuation was terrible and I fixed it, or their steps were out of order and I fixed it. Now, if you show them their steps were out of order, and if you do the steps in the order they specified, somebody would die, That I find compelling. But to say they didn't do it right and I do a better job than they do is, you're not going to get very far with that, because it sounds like it's coming out of, sorry, but elementary school, right? Sounds like something you'd hear on the playground. So you want to go down the road of, it is important for this document to be done this way, and leave out the by me and their stupid part. It is important for this document to be done in this certain way, because otherwise the business will be affected in this way. So when you say that you're providing, that the details you're providing add value, you need to prove that. How do those details add value? Why do those details add value? And what happens if they're not there? So those are the kinds of questions that I would ask, not knowing a whole lot about, you know, your particular situation, unfortunately. All right, cross-pollination. Interesting question. How do you begin to make the case for cross-pollination of Techcomm and Marcom? Well, you want to show that there's business value there, that there's a reason for doing it, not just, you know, we think it would be cool or anything like that. But I would look for things like, is there already information that's overlapping or that should overlap? Are there cases where the marketing content, for example, contradicts the Techcomm content in describing the same thing? Are there cases where Marcom uses terminology that's different from the terminology that Techcomm is using, even though they're describing the same thing, because they, you know, they just don't talk to each other? So maybe one of them uses the term mini blinds, and the other one uses the term, you know, metal blinds or horizontal blinds or something. And you can't, you know, now you get questions saying, well, I want to buy mini blinds, and you say, oh, those are the horizontal blinds over here. Well, wait a minute. Why aren't the terms the same? Those kinds of things. So I would look for those kinds of questions. Issues where you have content that is related, that should be similar, that should be the same, but isn't. I would also look for cases where there's not a clear-cut separation between the Techcomm responsibility and the Marcom responsibility. And, you know, data sheets are one example of that. You may have others, where you really want to align how that content is being written and bring them together, because right now you're doing them separately, and, you know, it just takes time and it costs money. So I would look for places where the non-integration of Techcomm and Marcom is expensive. So I would start there. Okay, a comment here that within a consumer web application, the writer writing the user assistance text really needs the user orientation of the tech writer with a Marcom writing style, a rare skill that seems called content writer. And yes, I think that's sort of that beginning of this convergence where we're not saying marketing writer or technical writer, we're just sort of having these sort of content writer people, and they're producing something that's not really it's neither fish nor fowl, right? It's kind of one or the other. Okay, another comment here. Important to realize that lots of traditions in Techcomm don't necessarily add value. For example, conventions used in this manual, etc. I'm going to attribute that to somebody else anonymous so that I don't take the blame for it, even though I totally agree. But I'm going to blame that on anonymous commenter. And you can take it up with anonymous commenter number 3, it looks like. So yeah, but I mean, I agree. There are things that we do, and this is actually true in Marcom as well. There are things that Techcomm or content communications people do, as a matter of course, that we find offensive when they're not done correctly, that nobody else will ever notice. Nobody is going to notice page breaks. Nobody cares. I mean, we care, but nobody else cares, and that's just an unfortunate kind of fact of what we're dealing with. So that is life in that area. Okay, so if you okay, anonymous number 3 has outed himself and said, you can call me Alan. He was the one that mentioned the adding value and the traditions not adding value. I should hasten to add that it is not my coworker Alan, so I'm going to get myself in all sorts of trouble here. Okay, so one of the things that we're seeing is this move towards more convergent, more sort of global strategy. But I want to emphasize that one thing we're not seeing a lot of is, you may recall this sort of enterprise CMS movement where we were supposed to vacuum up all email, all, everything that was going on within the enterprise, not unlike what apparently the NSA is doing these days. And we were supposed to then take that and put it all in this magic enterprise CMS and then be able to do cool stuff with it. I don't think that necessarily works for our purposes. For our purposes, all those emails flying around are not that useful. What is useful is the high-value content that somebody has actually thought about and worked through and considered carefully what are the implications of this content and how are we going to work through it. Okay, and I'm going to give you a couple more seconds if there are any other questions. If not, we're going to wrap up early today and let everybody go off and eat lunch or dinner or breakfast or go back to sleep or whichever one it might be. I do have, let's see, I believe I have one or two more slides. I have some contact information. If you do have a specific problem that you want to talk to us about, we will be more than happy to address that. So there's the contact information. And then one final slide is, I mentioned the book at the beginning. The complete text of the Content Strategy 101 book is available for free on contentstrategy101.com, so you can get it from there. You can print, EPUB, and Kindle versions are also available. Those are less than free, but we do have an HTML website version of this, so if you'd like to go and take a look at it, that would be great. And with that, thank you all for coming. We have some other webcasts coming up. Take a look at scriptorium.com/events, and you can see the various webcasts that are coming down the line there, including one on managing data implementation, which Alan Pringle will be doing in August, and some other interesting stuff coming down the line. So happy summer to you, to those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, and if you're way down south, then I suppose you're in some sort of a winter break. So thank you all, and we will see you soon.